Leon Dash spent over 30 years with the Washington Post from 1966 to 1998. In 1995, he won a Pulitzer Prize for his 8-part front-page series on poverty and survival in urban America. Leon Dash spent 4 years following the life of Rosa Lee Cunningham and her 8 children and 5 grandchildren. He appeared on the television program Booknotes in November of 1996 to discuss his published book, which focused on the named phenomena of the underclass in the United States. In the last 26 years, Leon Dash has been a professor of journalism and African American studies at the University of Illinois. We asked him for an update on his original story.
As more people cancel cable TV, C-SPAN's funding is at risk. This summer, an anonymous donor has stepped up to help by matching all donations up to $25,000. I'm Caitlin with C-SPAN, and this means your gift will go twice as far. Your donation supports unfiltered access to government and public affairs programming, including the C-SPAN podcasts you value. Visit cspan.org/donate to make your gift today. Every dollar helps us reach our $25,000 goal. Thank you for listening and supporting C-SPAN. Donate today at cspan.org/donate.
Leon Dash, you've been away from Washington for a long time. You had a big hit of a story when you were here. We'll talk about that in a second. But what's the world been looking like as a professor from the University of Illinois for the last, 20-some years?
Oh, the world itself looks good. It's my keeping up with the world. The world changes so fast nowadays, both from technological and political and social foundations. Everything changes. Attitudes change. I've been here at the University of Illinois since 1998. But the students I had when I started out are not the type of students I have today. It's amazing to me.
What's the difference?
I find the students that I have today, since post-pandemic, are much needier and more fragile than the students that I had when I came in 1998.
Is there any way you've changed your teaching because of that?
No. Teaching remains the same, but I have to engage the students more today and have them insist that they come and talk to me because I don't think they're going to do well in the class at the rate they're doing. And that is usually evident by mid-semester.
What's the favorite course that you've taught over the last some years?
Immersion journalism, which is the process of interviewing people long-term and getting them to reveal some of the truths about themselves that they don't do generally initially when you begin interviewing a person. So I give them a structured approach to it. Each student that takes the course must find a participant here in the Twin Cities of Urbana-Champaign and interview them 8 times during the semester. The first 4 are very structured: school history, family history, religion history or worldview, and the 4th being growing up outside the family. And usually between the 3rd and the 4th interview, the person begins to contradict what they told the student in the first 2 interviews, which I tell them to expect and to look for, but not to acknowledge.
Why is that?
Why is what? Why do they change?
Yes.
They become more comfortable with the student. They become more comfortable with the interviewer. They've taken an assessment of what the interviewer may or may not use with the material, because all these interviews are on the record, what the student may or may not do with the material that they tell them. And they become more comfortable confessing some of their faults and warts. And in that process, they begin to open up to the student and tell the student something that's closer to truth. I tell the students, don't try to get the absolute truth. Just try to get something closer to the truth, because the first story you're given is usually very camouflaged with a lot of detail missing that you would want to do. You'd want that detail when you sat down to write a profile of this person. So after those 4 interviews, then they focus on the contradictions, and they do 3 focus interviews on the contradictions that they presented. Without acknowledging, don't call them contradictions. Just say, when you begin the focus interviews, just say, I was very interested in what you had to say about your father's drinking history. What do you think about that? And it's up to the person being interviewed to characterize it as binge drinking or alcoholic drinking. Don't you, the interviewer, characterize it as such. Let the person characterize it.
Are those final products that they write published anywhere?
Some publish them. I leave it up to the student to try to get them published. Some have been successful. Most have not been.
When did you first learn about immersion journalism?
I started using it when I lived with the guerrillas in Angola in 76 or 77. What I was interested in doing, since I had access to the rank and file troops while we were traveling, I lived with them for 7.5 months. The UNITA guerrillas, who were fighting against the government of the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, 2 guerrilla groups that came out of the anti-colonial period, and they were fighting over who would rule Angola. But I was interested because so much of the Western press characterized the MPL, the Popular Movement, as pro-Soviet, and the UNITA guerrillas as pro-Western. And I began interviewing the guerrillas who were escorting me in a 2,100-mile trek through the war zone, looking for what their particular political outlook was or was not. And when you put things in the context of pro-Soviet, pro-Western, they didn't really know what you were talking about. They were fighting for their group, the Ubuntu, who dominated the UNITA guerrillas, not to be dominated by the Ubuntu, who dominated the MPLA movement. So you had 2 ethnic groups fighting over issues of ethnicity, and the Cold War aspect of it didn't play into their allegiances at all. So interviewing people multiple times began to reveal something that was what I was looking for, closer to the truth.
What did you do with what you learned?
I wrote a 7-part series in the Washington Post in August 77 about what I had learned.
What was the reaction to that series then?
Well, a lot of people followed it. I think most people followed it from the standpoint of adventure. Some people did follow it from the standpoint of looking at how the aspect of the Cold War was imposed on the Civil War in Angola without any reality to it.
When did you first know that you could write?
I think in February of '67, I did a piece on 14th Street called The Strip. And that was my first effort at writing something besides I started out as a police reporter. And when I wrote that piece, that was my first effort at writing something that was beyond police reporting. It gave a flavor of 14th Street as the vice hub of the Washington, D.C. at the time.
What came out of that particular series that you wrote? What led to, your famous book on Rosa Lee Cunningham?
What was your question again?
I said, what came out of that experience in relationship to your famous book that you did that got you a Pulitzer Prize on Rosa Lee Cunningham?
That's why I don't see the two as connected. One was '67, when I was beginning my career, and Rosa Lee came out in '94. My reporting experience taught me how to be an experienced reporter, but I don't think the 14th Street strip story contributed to that at that point.
The only reason I mentioned that is because you, in your story about Rosa Lee Cunningham, you talked about her selling drugs in the corner of 14th and U, which is somewhat, I assume, down in the same area.
It is down in the same area. And in fact, a police lieutenant took me around some of the drug corners on 14th Street at that time in '67. Um, but again, that was just for a look-see. I didn't get involved in. I had never thought at that point approaching drug dealers to do a long-term project with them in terms of interviewing. I didn't know that that was possible.
We first talked about your book back in 1996. And for those that didn't, I mean, it's available for anybody that wants to hear the whole interview on our C SPAN archives. But for those who don't know the story, give us some background on who she was and why you wrote it.
Rosa Lee Cunningham was, when I met her, she was an adult woman who had been cycling in and out of the D.C. prison. Well, we became interested when I was doing an adolescent childbearing study in Washington Highlands, a very poor community in Washington, D.C., east of the Anacostia River. And while I was doing this study, I found that families that I was engaged with, 6 families, and looking at adolescent childbearing in each of those families, they were really mired in intergenerational poverty. And at that time, when I was doing the study, which was 84 to 86, there was a lot of discussion about the underclass and the formation of the underclass. And the Urban Institute in Washington issued a study of what is the underclass and what makes up the underclass and the definition of what the underclass is. And as soon as I finished the adolescent childbearing study, and that was published in the Post in 86, time flies, doesn't it?
It does.
When I finished the adolescent childbearing study, 4 years later, I was able to begin on what I wanted to do, an underclass study. And the Urban Institute definition of what formed an underclass family gave me an idea of where to look. And the Urban Institute said that an underclass family is headed by a female-headed. When all the adults in the family are either underemployed or unemployed. Most of the members of the family are marginally educated, and that petty criminal enterprise leading to criminal recidivism was the dominant factor in contribution to the family's welfare stipend. One of the parts of the definition was that the family was also welfare dependent. And understanding that, I had done a series with Ben Bakdicki and a colleague on prisons in the United States in the 1970s. So I understood that when they said that most of the family members were criminal recidivists, that the best place to go look for them would be in the DC prison system. And that turned out to be true, because I knew that 50% of the DC prison system was made up of criminal recidivists, people who cycle in and out of the prison, usually connected to drug addiction on a regular basis. So I went into the DC jail looking for the families that I thought I was going to follow several families, looking for the families that I wanted to follow. And I chose 4 families out of many people that I interviewed, because they had the classic parts of the Urban Institute's definition of what constituted an underclass family. And one of those 4 families was Rosa Lee, one of the 4 people that I interviewed. Rosa Lee, I remember interviewing her in female cell block over 9 days, using that methodology I just laid out to you: school history, family history, religion, exposure to religion, and growing up outside the family. And I immediately knew that she and her 8 adult children, 6 of whom were criminal recidivists, were going to be part of the study. And Rosa Lee had been cycling in and out of the DC prison system, first as a juvenile, beginning at about age 14, for shoplifting, and then gradually moving into drug addiction herself and then drug dealing. And her last arrest had been at the corner of 14th and Q Street Northwest, selling drugs to feed herself and her 3 of her grandchildren because her youngest daughter at the time was in the D.C. jail on a crack cocaine arrest. So I started my interviews with her in the D.C. jail in January 1988. And then in 1990, I began doing a full-time study of the 4 families that I wanted to follow, that I had met. I met the heads of in the D.C. jail, but that became impossible following the 4 families because drug addiction was a driving factor in their daily lives. So they either were trying to get money to buy drugs, to use drugs, and if they had used drugs and were high, they didn't want to sit down for a 2-hour interview with me about any aspect of their lives, except for Rosa Lee. Because her younger daughter was still in the D.C. jail system when she was released in May of 1988, she had gone into the methadone program so that she could look after her 3 grandchildren. And so she was drug-free. So she became one of the persons that I followed very closely. I interviewed her from 1990 to 1994. I interviewed her multiple times, all 8 of her adult children, multiple times, 5 of her grandchildren, and 6 of her brothers and sisters.
When you did the interviews, did you record them or did you write the answers in a notebook?
No, I recorded them. An old-fashioned tape recorder.
Did you have to transcribe those tapes?
Yes. I transcribed the tapes. First, I had transcribers at the Washington Post transcribing them. But then I began transcribing them myself so that I could really absorb all the material about her life rather than just reading it, but hearing it again, listening to the tapes.
How hard was it to get access to the jail?
It wasn't hard at all. I went to the head of the Department of Corrections, told him what I would be doing, and he opened up the jail to me. I was in and out of the jail for the next 18 months. Now, as a factor in this, what happened was that I began going into the jail in the summer of 1987, and interviewing inmates and looking for the people that I wanted to interview. And I noticed now in Washington in summer, any summer, usually in August, it's like living in a hot bowl of soup. Very humid, very hot. But I noticed that the corrections officers, because I was going in at the staff entrance, not the visitors' entrances, I was going in with the staff. I noticed that the correctional officers were coming to work wearing long sleeve shirts in the summer. And I thought that was odd. But then I also began noticing fresh track marks on some of the officers that indicated to me that they were intravenous drug abusers, because these were not old scars, they were fresh marks, which some of them were still with scabs on them. And you can see them because the cotton shirts that they part of the uniform were shrinking as they would when you wash them. So they weren't covering all the marks. And then there were at least 3 overdoses on the correctional officer staff, and they had to be rushed next door to DC General Hospital to be revived and brought back. And I knew enough and people were telling me these things, that an officer had been rushed out of a cell block to DC General because he or she had overdosed. And I knew enough about drug addiction to know that they hadn't used drugs at home and come to work and passed out. That the passing out was usually immediate, so they were using drugs on secure posts inside the DC jail, which was astounding to me. Well, I was really focused on the underclass study. I got diverted into this look-see at the DC Correctional Force and found that there was a lot of drug abuse among the force, and many of them were smuggling drugs into the DC jail to pay for their habits. And they would be paid on the outside they would smuggle the drugs into the jail for an inmate, and inmates' friends or family would pay them on the outside. So I had to do that series first. And that was published in June of 1990. Then, after taking vacation and coming back to work in August of 1990 is when I began seriously working on what I wanted to do with Rosa Lee Cunningham and her family.
You said when we talked in '96 that there were 3 million people in the United States in the underclass.
Yes, that's what, again, according to the Urban Institute study.
What do you think it is today?
I have no idea. At first, I thought it was growing exponentially, but I was corrected on that by someone who followed it regularly, a guy named Ron Minus, who went off to work at or teach at on the faculty at Columbia University in New York. So I haven't really talked about or looked up the underclass since then, so I don't know what the figures are today.
Why did Rosa Lee Cunningham agree to talk to you?
That's a good question. A number of people who ask me, why do people talk to me and expose all the inside of their own lives and the pain and the things that they've gone through in their lives? And I've never had a good answer for that. All I know is that I approach someone and tell them what I'm doing. I'm very upfront about what I'm doing, because I don't want to, down the road, after investing time and effort into a person, for them to change their mind. Tell them what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And with Rosa Lee, her arrest was, let's see, I met her in '90, so she was arrested in October of 1997 at 14th and Q, selling drugs. And she went through, she was also addicted, and she went through a terrible withdrawal in the DC jail. They don't give you any Valium or sedative or anything else. You go through your withdrawal from drug addiction, cold turkey. And she had a young female inmate in the same cell as her who looked after her, took care of her literally, from the time she came into the jail until she had come out of the withdrawal and the pain, the sickness, which was about December of 19.
Did they?
She was arrested October 97. No, I'm sorry, I've got the dates wrong. She was arrested in October. I met her in 1998. She was arrested in 1987, October 1987. I met her in January of 1988 because I had what they call a classification and parole officer, a guy named Francis Henderson, who was helping me identify members of the underclass and approaching them for interviews and going to their cell blocks to meet them and so on. And Rosa Lee was on his caseload. And Rosa Lee came to him telling him that she thought that she was going to die. And she wanted to tell him her life story. And maybe it would be an example for others not to follow. And Francis said, well, Rosa Lee, I don't have time to really listen to you. You're just one person on a big caseload that I have, but there's a reporter coming in here every day who's interviewing people about their life stories, and I'm going to introduce you to him. So he introduced us in January of 1988 on a Friday, if I remember correctly, and then I began interviewing Rosa Lee the next Monday and interviewed her for 9 days in one of the female cell blocks. And so that was the basis of our relationship. She had a story to tell that she felt would be a good example of people not to follow, and I was going to be the storyteller. It's as simple as that.
I have a clip from our discussion back in '96 that I think you'll agree when you hear it. It goes to the one of the hardest stories that you tell. It's only about 44 seconds. Let's listen to you from that interview, and then you can expand on the situation.
When Patty was 11, Rosa Lee prostituted Patty with an adult customer of Rosa Lee's. A man who she knew as a regular customer came by and asked her one day, could he have sex with her daughter? And Rosa Lee went then and approached Patty and asked Patty, would she be willing to have sex with this adult man? The man was in his 40s and Patty was 11 years old. And Patty agreed because her mother had asked her to. She felt that when Patty first told me about that, she felt that she was helping her mother bring income into the house because the man was willing to pay twice as much to have sex with her than to have sex with her mother.
What was your reaction when you started hearing things like this?
Well, it wasn't shocking to me. It was something that I expected. Every now and then, you can pick up the paper and read about a mother prostituting her daughter somewhere in the United States. So that her mother had prostituted her two adult males as an 11-year-old child didn't really shock me. But it was the one thing that Rosa Lee consistently lied to me about. Patty was included into the project. I approached her the same way I approached her mother. And she agreed to be in the project, and she wanted her story told. And she wanted this part of her story told, that her mother had prostituted her as an 11-year-old girl with adult men. And she said that was the cause of her drug use, beginning at an early age, as a young teenager. So I wasn't shocked by it. Patty told me about it in great detail a number of times when she was not on drugs. So I had the feeling that she was telling me the truth. And when I approached Rosa Lee about it, Patty wasn't there. And Rosa Lee lied to me about it and said she would never do that. But I already knew enough about Rosa Lee to know that she was not telling me the truth. So I waited on a day that Patty was not using drugs. And Rosa Lee and Patty, I took Rosa Lee and Patty over to the welfare center in Washington where they had to do some paperwork for welfare eligibility. And then we went to lunch at Rosa Lee's favorite place, McDonald's. And I said to Rosa Lee, well, Rosa Lee got up and went to the ladies' room. And I told Patty, I said, now your mother's been telling me that you have been lying to me. And I want to now have a come to Jesus meeting with the three of us. I'm going to ask you about what you told me in front of your mother and see what she has to say. So when Rosa Lee returned from the ladies' room, I told Rosa Lee, we're going to talk, three of us now are going to talk about what Patty's been telling me about you prostituting her when she was a child. And Rosa Lee said, oh, Lord. I said, yes, that too. And she tried to get out of it. She tried to get Patty to say that it hadn't happened. Patty wasn't having it. She wanted it on the record, and she wanted her story told. In fact, when the series ran, I think Patty's story was maybe the sixth part of the series, 8-part series. And Patty called me from the DC jail. Patty could barely read because she had never gone beyond the 4th grade. But Patty called me from the DC jail because the inmates in the jail were reading the series to her. And she complained to me. She said, you haven't told my story. I said, your story runs tomorrow. And she said, oh, okay. I said, I haven't forgotten you. I said, it's the story that the day she called me was a story about her two brothers, Eric Cunningham and Alvin Cunningham, and Eric Wright, the two of her 6 sons who never got into drugs and never got into criminal recidivism.
You can, by the way, people that are possibly interested in reading the series, it's online.
It is, yeah.
All 8 parts, which ran over 8 days. Have you been in touch with any of the 8 children? I know one of them died, I remember from our interview, but have you been in touch with any of the children since this series ran?
Yes. I've been in touch with, let's see, Bobby, the oldest, died. And then the second boy, Ronnie, he died. Third born, Alvin, died just in recent years.
Of what, by the way?
Diabetes. I went to his funeral. And then after Alvin is Richard, he's dead. And
what did he die of?
Complications leading to long-term drug abuse. I don't know the specific diagnosis, but it was related to his long-term drug abuse. I said same thing. Bobby died of AIDS, the oldest boy, and Ronnie died of complications of drug abuse. Alvin died of diabetes. Then Richard died of long-term drug abuse. And then after Richard is Eric. Eric is still alive. He's retired and lives in North Carolina. He retired as a driver for the school system, driving handicapped children back and forth to school. He retired from that maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And we talk periodically. Then after Eric is Patty. She was imprisoned in a federal women's prison for setting up her boyfriend to be robbed by crack dealers, and they ended up killing him. And she was charged as an accessory to murder. But since she testified against the men that she had set up her boyfriend with, she was discharged with, she was given a reduced sentence, pled guilty for robbery. So a number of years she spent in a federal prison in Connecticut, women's prison in Connecticut. And she was released, I know this from her son. She was released in I want to say 2018. And while she was in prison, she also had AIDS, but she was treated with retrovirus drugs. And when she came out, she wouldn't follow the regimen that was required. She died shortly after, within months of coming out of prison from AIDS. Then after Patty is Ducky, and Ducky, the last I knew of him, he was cycling in and out of prison, usually on drug charges. And the DC prison system now is no longer a city system. It's a city farms out this inmates to other prison systems. And last time I heard from him was he was in North Carolina, but that's many years ago. I haven't heard of him dying. Usually I get a call when I'm dying, when one of them has died. And then is the youngest of Rosa Lee's children is a woman I never mentioned her name, because she, at the end, when I was getting ready to write, decided she just wanted to be known by a pseudonym and no photos of her to run. So I didn't mention her at all, mention her name, and didn't run any photos about her, and didn't tell her story. She had a very powerful story, but I didn't tell it because she changed the agreement that we had and wanted to be known, her story to be told anonymously. In fact, she tried to get her mother, Rosa Lee, to change her agreement with me, and Rosa Lee refused. Said she wanted her story told.
Did you have to get signed agreements on all of these participants?
No. I interviewed them and asked them whether they willingly participated. It was all on the recordings. I didn't do any signed agreements at all. No.
What year did Rosa Lee die?
She died.
I think I'm looking at July 8th, 1995 was the obituary in the Post, I think.
Yeah, okay, so she died July 7th, 1995.
What did she die of?
Died of AIDS.
And did she see any of this series?
The series was read to her. The series ran in September of 1994. So the entire series was read to her by a granddaughter, her youngest daughter's oldest daughter, and a family friend. Every part of the series. In fact, after the series ran, we met again at our favorite McDonald's, which was right there on New York Avenue Northeast when you enter into the city from Maryland. And she told me she had one complaint about my series. And I said, okay, I was ready for her to say any number of things. She said that it made her son Eric look too good. Wow. I broke out laughing. I said, that's your only complaint? She said, that's my only complaint.
Why did she say that?
Because Eric came across, from her point of view, as too perfect. And she knew he was she from her standpoint, she felt Eric was a deeply flawed individual.
But Eric did not get into drugs. Am I remembering that correctly?
He and Alvin
Yeah.
never got into drugs, never got into criminal recidivism. In fact, at one point, Eric was a correctional officer at the DC jail, and Rosa Lee was brought in on a charge. This was before I met either of them, and he was on probation. And she was busy telling all the inmates and the officers, "That's my son over there. That's my son over there." And he was a probationary officer. He only worked there for a couple of years and left. I forget the reasons why.
So, how much of this do you use in your classrooms teaching at the University of Illinois?
I have the students read parts of When Children Want Children, when to show them what they can achieve with time and effort, in terms of getting people to turn around and tell them something that's closer to the truth. Because all of the adolescents in the adolescent childbearing study had lied to me about how they had become pregnant, or they knew their girlfriend became pregnant when I began the project. But after 16 months of interviewing, they all, during different parts of the interviews, they all told me that that they had conceived a child purposely. And that was a revelation for many people. So we go through When Children Want Children, then we go through Rosa Lee, and going through the layers of Rosa Lee's life and the difficult parts, particularly her prostituting her oldest daughter when the daughter was a child. And I had them comment on it, we discuss it. We discuss their approach, because each time we meet for 3 hours once a week, and we discuss their progress with their person that they're interviewing, and where they think the person is not being candid with them, and where they think the person is being candid with them, or when the contradictions begin to appear. They're often stunned. What he told me 2 weeks ago, what he told me yesterday, is a big difference. I said, yes, I hope you didn't make note of that. No, because I forewarned them don't slam on the table and say, "That's not what you told me 2 weeks ago." You expect people not to tell you, not to be fully candid with you when you begin the project. The candidacy will come with your increasing interaction with them. They will become candid.
As you know, and this is in the Washington Post Readers React, in conjunction with this, you can get through Google, that some 4,600 phone calls came in on a special line, and they have transcribed some of them in this research that I did. And I want to read some of them and get your reaction to it, because some of it was criticism of the articles, and I'm sure you've read them. But here's a woman, Gwendolyn Audrey, from Landover, Maryland, right outside the city of Washington. My great-grandparents were sharecroppers and came to Washington in 1946 from South Carolina. Our lives were not at all like Rosa Lee's. No one went to jail, nobody on drugs, everybody's working, and everybody got an education. I think we should see the other side of this story. And you know that comment came from several people.
Yes. And it all doesn't surprise me. I mean, a lot of the time that I spent with Rosa Lee, I would say to myself, "There but for the grace of God go I," given the circumstances and the cyclical drug use and so on that they went through. My parents didn't come out of sharecropping, but they were a working class couple and raising 2 sons. And there were drugs all around us, but my brother and I, knew better than to take any of them or be involved with them. So that for us was not a temptation. We also got very good educations, not through the New York City. We were growing up in New York, not through the New York City public school system, or in the segregated community of Harlem that we lived in, but because our parents sent us to private schools when we got to high school. When I got to high school, my parents sent me to a private high school. And for my brother, he was sent to a private junior high school and went through a private high school as well. So that gave us a very different foundation. So I understand what Gwendolyn's talking about in terms of she and herself and her family didn't experience any of this, but I was writing about people who do.
I have
I
another
can't-
one here. This is from Cecily Counts Blakey of Northeast Washington. This line: when are you going to do a story about a white person who moved from Appalachia and is still in a trailer park 3 generations later? This is an old story, a tired story, meaning the story that you wrote.
Right. Well, I understand that point of view as well. Um, Many black people feel defensive about circumstances of the black underclass and want writers to focus on the white underclass. I was interested in doing a study of the underclass, period, black or white. When you live in Washington, D.C., the underclass is black. Black middle, the three major groups in Washington, D.C.: middle class whites, middle class blacks, and poor blacks. And the underclass forms a subset of the poor blacks in Washington, D.C. So there were no descendants of Appalachia to write about. If I was posted in Appalachia, then I could easily do a series on an Appalachian family. So I understand the complaint, but they're not accessible in Washington, D.C. to follow for 4 years. I mean, an Appalachian white family, yeah.
Another comment from Denise Kellogg of Arlington, Virginia. These are old comments, but about your series. I don't understand why the Washington Post is trying to engender support or sympathy for this woman. The only thing that poverty has to do with it is that it allows her to use government money to support her drug habit and her children's drug habits.
There's a lot of truth to that. They relied on their welfare stipend to keep them going in their drug habit, both Rosa Lee and her 6 addicted children. I don't know what to say. I mean, I was writing about the underclass, and I was trying to get as candid a picture as I could, and it upset a lot of people.
What would you say was the overall reaction that you got to the series and to the book later on?
A lot of criticism from the black middle class. Some people feel that they were enlightened. I still get comments now and then from people who have read the book recently and came out of the exact same lifestyle and thanked me for writing it. Those are in the minority, however. Most of the criticism comes from the black middle class, who are very defensive about the black poor and the black underclass.
When we talked over 25 years ago, you said that at the time 50% of black women had children out of wedlock, and the latest figure I've seen is about 70%. That's gone up since you did
Really?
this series.
I didn't know that.
Well,
And I was talking about it in the context of the underclass study or the adolescent childbearing study.
you know, I talked to you about both of those. I don't remember exactly. But
Okay.
I guess my question to you is, as you were doing this, you've had a lot of time to think it over, what causes this, in your opinion, this kind of lifestyle?
Lack of education and social isolation, in poverty, trapped in poverty, generational poverty.
Did Rosa Lee Cunningham marry?
Once, the father of her third son, Alvin Cunningham, she married him because she was underage with a third child, and her mother met the father of her third child, who was a veteran from the Army, and told him that she would have him locked up for sexual abuse of her daughter if he didn't marry her, and he married her. But then he also beat her terribly, abused her physically. And one time Rosa Lee came home after a beating, and her mother told her, "You don't have to go back to him." And she did. But that's sad, because her maiden name was Wright. She was married Rosa Lee Wright. She was born Rosa Lee Wright. And then she was the subsequent children that she had after Alvin. She had 5 more. She would switch between Wright and Cunningham, uh, the names of the children. So some children were given the name Wright, some children were given the name Cunningham.
What's the reaction to this comment by a person named Mills in Upper Marlboro, Maryland? All people face problems. The question is, how do they solve their problems? This is where the black church should have come in and help these people. What's your reaction to that?
Well, Rosa Lee was very involved in the church. She grew up in the church. I don't know if the church really answers. The church may give you sustenance, food, emotional support, and maybe even a place to live temporarily. But the church doesn't, as far as I know, supply the things that will allow you to get over the circumstances of poverty. And the number one circumstance of poverty is education. So you'd have to make a substantial investment in the education. You'd have to make a substantial investment in the education facilities available to people living in segregated circumstances to make a significant difference in people who are trapped in poverty.
You talk about Rosa Lee using methadone as a substitute or a way to, stop the. You were saying? Go ahead.
Substitute to heroin.
To heroin. Do they still do it? Do they still use methadone?
I don't know. I don't know anything about methadone programs or nothing.
Did it work for? And as a matter of fact, I wanted to ask you whether they use methadone in prison at all or in jail when they're trying to recover from being a drug addict.
I have no idea. They didn't when I was doing the initial study of Rosa Lee in the 90s. Now, what they do today, because DC's under a private prison system, it's no longer a government agency. I don't know what they do there, one way or the other.
Why did you decide to leave the Washington Post? Go ahead.
Out here in Plainsville, Illinois, I'm far away from that.
No, that's what I was going to ask you. Why did you decide to leave the Washington Post and become a professor at the University of Illinois?
Well, I had 4 offers come to me, and it was time for me to move on. The editors that I worked under were getting younger and younger, and there were disagreements over a significant disagreement over what I should be doing in terms of projects that I wanted to look at. So some editors supported me in the ethnographic approach I was making to investigative journalism, and other editors did not. And when it became clear that I would not be able to pursue the ethnographic study, I think the last series I did for the Washington Post was Young Male Killers, and that was published even after I left. But one of the editors that I was talking to said, well, while I was working on that project, that I would be allowed to continue that project, but after that project was published, then I'd have to move to more conventional paper trail investigative journalism. That didn't interest me at all. I told him that I'd already done that. So when he told me that was in March of '97, and he wanted to know when I thought the series for Young Male Killers would be done. And I said by the summer of '98. Which was my time frame, using the method I told you about, multiple interviews. And then I began, right after that lunch, I began looking for other places to move to, because I wasn't finished working. I still was raising my younger daughter. I was raising my older daughter too. She was a Howard student, so I was paying college tuition and looking after my younger daughter. So I still had responsibilities. I just couldn't quit. So I began looking for a job in academia. One of the first places I called was where the magazine Encounter was based at Duke University. Encounter was a magazine that I'd become familiar with because it was doing the kind of work that I was doing. Taking an in-depth look at the circumstances of people's lives and figure out why they were making the choices they were making. And they then came up with an offer they were based at Duke University in North Carolina. So they came up with, they manufactured, they created an offer for me from Duke University. And then I got an offer from this university, University of Illinois. Then I got an offer from USC in Los Angeles. And then the fourth order was the University of Texas, University of Kansas, in Lawrence, Kansas. When I began traveling to the four universities to be interviewed and to interact with faculty and students, in that period, I decided on the University of Illinois was the most attractive place for me to come to, because I figured my younger daughter, who was just finishing high school, and she graduated in spring of 1998, she would be coming with me. And University of Illinois had my younger daughter has cerebral palsy, and she's a young adult woman with disabilities. So University of Illinois had the most extensive support system for students with disabilities, and the first in the United States in higher education. It was created in 1948, first for World War II veterans, but then expanded to all incoming students with disabilities. And when I saw what was available here for students with disabilities, I decided on the University of Illinois. And it was the right choice. My daughter graduated from here in 2005.
What's she doing now?
She lives independently in Rockville, Maryland. She was working for a number of years at Swarthmore Music Center in Montgomery County. Right now, she's unemployed but living independently in Rockville, Maryland.
What's your other daughter doing?
She's a physician's assistant for a medical group that provides medical care for the elderly and the poor.
The Washington Post, under the ownership of Mr. Bezos, has done a lot of, I don't know if to say a lot of, but a lot of very long articles. And I think on the day we're talking, there's a huge article in there, like 8 pages or something like that.
No kidding. I haven't read the paper yet.
But basically it's immersion journalism. This particular reporter spent 2 years, I think. It's a story out of Michigan, the gun story of the parents that were convicted of buying the gun that the.
Oh yes. I looked at it, but I didn't read it. Okay.
How much immersion journalism that you very much involved in is still existent?
Well, long form journalism is, you still see it. You see it in magazines. You see it in some newspapers like the New York Times and Washington Post. So it's not ubiquitous, but those institutions that have the ability and the wherewithal and the foresight to do it are still doing it. And I'm glad that you made note of it still going on at the Washington Post, because there's been a sea change in the editors and reporters at the Washington Post. I don't know anyone there any longer, so
but
I'm glad to see that.
Going back to the differences you had with your editors about the kind of journalism, why didn't they like it, and why did they want you off it?
Well, there was one particular editor, and I won't get into names and personalities, that didn't think it was as worthwhile as doing the conventional investigative journalism. Didn't see the value of ethnographic journalism. And I disagreed. But I didn't have any power to change his particular outlook. And he was insisting that I go, once the Young Male Killers project was published, he was insisting that I go back to conventional investigative journalism.
You were one of the leaders of something called the Metro 7.
Yes, I was one of the members.
I know, but I said one of the leaders. But did you start it?
No, a group of us just started discussing the situation at the Washington Post. Well, the circumstances was that I had agitated for increased integration of the newsroom when I was working at the Post from 65 to 68. And then I went into the Peace Corps with the idea, or the thought really, naively, that changes were on the way and changes would be made, and the newsroom was becoming more place of inclusion. The Post gave me a 2-year leave of absence, so I went into the Peace Corps. I was a rural high school teacher in Kenya for 2 years. Then came back to the Post in February of 1971. And I was stunned because nothing had changed from the fall of '68 to February of 1971. So I began talking to other black reporters at the Washington Post about what we could do to really bring about some change. And some agreed, some didn't. But we put together this group. All of us contributed to putting together this group. We started out with 9 reporters. The older members of the staff who were black, we didn't include them, particularly if they were married with children. We figured that they would not want to put their jobs on the line if they had the responsibility of children. And so we began meeting at one of the members' houses on a regular basis, a guy named Richard Prince, very active today, has a column called Journalisms, runs on the internet. And over a matter of maybe a month of meetings, we came up with a list of 20 questions that we wanted to confront Ben Bradley with. And in January of 1972, myself and another reporter, Joe Strickland, delivered the letters personally delivered the 20 questions to Bradley. And you could see by the expression on his face that he knew this was going to be problematic. And we just left him with the questions. And after that, he and the managing editor, Bradley was executive editor, the managing editor, Howard Simons, arranged with us to meet with us and talk to us. I think we had 2 or 3 meetings. And at the last meeting, Bradley told us we were asking for 35% black representation in every job category in the newsroom. And he said that would be impossible and it would be too costly. And
but let me just interrupt. That was based on the black population in this entire Washington area, 35%?
Washington, not the black population of D.C. Very good point.
Yeah.
But I think the black population in D.C. at the time was 7% black. So we were basing that on metropolitan representation in their subscriber base, or metropolitan Washington. And he told us no, and then he also he told us what he was willing to do. He was going to hire 1 black person here or 1 black person there and do this and do that. And we didn't find that acceptable. So on March 23rd, we filed a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission against the Washington Post as being a discriminatory employer. And the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission then began an investigation. The day we filed the complaint, we held a press conference at a church announcing our complaint. And after the press conference, which lasted about an hour, we went back to work at the Washington Post. We held the press conference a block away from the Washington Post at a historic AME church on M Street. And we went back to work right after the press conference. And then that was in March. Then in November, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission issued this report and called the Washington Post a discriminatory employer as a result of their investigation. And then we tried to negotiate, but Joseph Califano, representing the Washington Post, said the Washington Post was not going to negotiate with us until the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission withdrew its findings of the Post being a discriminatory employer. And the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission said, no, we're not going to do that. And then Califano said, well, the Post was not going to negotiate with you, and the complaint, meaning myself and the Metro 7, because we started with 9, we dropped down to 7, 2 people dropped out. And that's how we came to be called the Metro 7. So the commissioners of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, we were asking then the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to take the Washington Post to court. And up till then, we had been represented by Clifford Alexander, who was a lawyer in Arnold Porter. and they had represented us pro bono. But they said, we go to court, we're not going to be representing you pro bono. I don't remember what the hourly rate was, but the 7 of us couldn't come up with the hourly rate at Holland Porter, whatever it was, $100, $300, didn't matter. It was beyond our reach. And so then we asked the commission to take the Washington Post to court to settle the matter. The commission voted not to take the Washington Post to court, but voted to give us the right to take the Washington Post to court. So that's where the matter sat, and I think it still sits there today. But it was effective in getting the Washington Post to make changes, both the public notoriety, their own reporters soon complaining about discrimination in the newsroom, and the fact that we had the right to take the Washington Post to court if we ever came up with the money to get legal representation. Yeah.
What percentage of students that you teach are African American?
Oh, a very small percentage. Most women, and I know that 8% of the University of Illinois, 8% of the, well, it's less than that now. When I was looking at it in depth maybe 20 years ago, it was 8%. But it's about, I think it's between, well, it's around 6%. Now, it's a total undergraduate body of the University of Illinois, which is about 46,000 students.
So what kind of
So I think undergraduate students are 36,000 and 10,000 graduate students. And about 8%, 6% of the undergraduate body is made up of black students. Yeah. So in my classes, maybe, with each of my classes, I have, let's say, with 6, usually I teach a class of 16 students, 2 classes a semester. And usually there are 3 or 4 black women and maybe 1 or 2 black males.
Why are you still teaching?
Oh, I enjoy it. I have my younger daughter harasses me. And he says, "Why are you still teaching? When are you going to retire?" And I said, you need to be careful because there are federal laws against harassing the elderly about retirement. She just laughs at me because she's not fazed by anything I say. But I have no intention to retire at the moment.
And is there, I know you haven't not written a book since you've been there. Is there a book in you? Is there an autobiography or a memoir?
I'm working on a book now. I'm working on a book now called, the working title is American Voices, Defining Moments in Black and White. Over the last several years, I've been interviewing black and white Americans about what their defining ethnic moment was and the impact on their lives.
How many people have you talked to for this book?
Talked to too many. That's I always overextend myself. Maybe I've interviewed maybe 30 people, but I'm only looking at including 14's actual stories. I'll probably end up listing all the people who participated, but I won't tell their stories. It's just too much. Yeah.
And when do you intend to publish this?
I have no idea. I do it between classes and when I can, and I'm working on it this summer. I'm in the writing phase, though, I tell you that.
Leon Dash, professor at the University of Illinois, former Washington Post reporter, and author of the series on Rosa Lee Cunningham and a book of the same name. We thank you for taking this time with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.